one angle that we're going to try and look at here is looking at labor as a type of capital that is owned by the worker, and then seeing what kind of issues and questions that can give rise to. I was going to ask both Sparks and Knightley if they wanted to just briefly give what their thoughts are on this idea of labor as a type of capital owned by the worker and what implications they think that has for how workers should be compensated. And I guess maybe we should start with Stray Sparks because she kind of formulated the prompt for us.
Okay. Yeah. So with the context of labor as capital that is owned by the worker, I think it makes the most sense to compensate for the products of that labor. So ideally per unit production, if that is a thing that's happening, the exception for, so my position is more or less against hourly as the norm. So if it's an hour, like if it's a position of like sitting at a front desk, or answering phone calls, being available for a certain time period, being paid for your time makes sense because that is what you are like producing in a sense. But if it's something like, for example, drafting blueprints for something, then it makes sense to do it per blueprint. Or if you're doing transcripts, it makes sense to do it like per minute of transcribed audio, as opposed to it being an hourly. And I also have a stronger version of that position, which is that hourly in a case where it doesn't make sense is a type of wage slavery, but we can talk about that in detail more later. And that's my starting argument.
Okay, thank you. Knightley, do you want to give your preliminary thoughts on the topic?
Certainly. I think while per unit compensation has its advantages, there's only a few fields where it's an effective system. Most jobs don't have such a clear cut, produce X number of items a day, and every job has secondary duties that make it very beneficial to stay for more than just that baseline. If that made sense.
It does. So one of the things that I was thinking about in regards to like, say you have like a management position, right? That's not a very good one. Because if you have a management position, you need to be available to your employees, right? So maybe for the sake of argument, we could look at this as like remote work, because I think that might make this distinction more clear. Because like in-person work, you have to like physically be in the office to be available, which I personally think is annoying, but I get why that might be a thing in certain cases. But in today's economy, I don't think that is as necessary as people think it is. So looking at it from the context of remote work, I think that if somebody in a management position, for instance, they don't have per unit, they don't have units that they are producing. So the thing that they are producing with their labor is management. So that's, being aware of when employees need you, being supervising employees on a regular basis. I think as long as that is something that you are capable of doing, that it doesn't make sense to pay that per hour. It makes more sense to pay that one salary. Otherwise, there is an incentive to do more managing when maybe more managing is not necessary. Like it might be the case that the best way to manage somebody is to be mostly hands-off, check in, be available to answer questions, But if you do it hourly, then there's sort of like this pressure to always be doing and managing, even if it's not necessary.
Yeah, and that's fair. Um, my preferred method tends to be salary, even for traditionally hourly work. But a lot of salary jobs still have an hour, have an hourly requirement. Like even with the salary, you're still expected to be, X number of hours in the office, so much at home, so much, wherever, depending on how your job's set up.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I don't think in office hours make sense for quite a few jobs. And that's, I don't know, kind of related. So I'm talking about the idea of wage slavery. Having you come into the office for no reason. I mean, there's like a stated reason, right? But it's not, it doesn't help you do your job better, but you're still expected to do it because you're, expected to devote a certain number of hours to the company. And so it becomes more about your time being owned by the company versus you doing a job for the company, and like the job being like the labor that you're selling. So you're basically, if you assume that labor is like capital, what you're basically selling to your employer is the results. You're not selling your time, unless like I said, like a receptionist, like that is actually like a time-based task that you are actually selling your time.
Well, I would argue it's a little more than that, because what you're trading is, your labor, your work. So it makes sense to, to do more than, just what's expected, to, actually like provide an input, provide ideas, to learn other jobs in the system. This gets back to what I was saying on Sunday. There's always other jobs, and especially if you want to advance in whatever firm you happen to be in, taking on extra duties is a good way to see that and to show that you're able to handle either more responsibility or deserve more pay.
How does that work if you assume that labor is capital that is owned by the worker? So like when you, I don't know, like when you invest capital, like when you sell, I don't know, when you sell something to somebody. Yeah, we can just do it that way. Just like assume that we're selling products, right? If I want to sell a product to somebody and they're like, oh, I want this, I'm like, okay, so give me the money and then I'll give you the thing. I'm not going to give them extra in hopes that they're going to give me more money.
No, true, but you might give them a discount to get them to come back. You might sell at a loss to help introduce people to a new product, or even just to take over, to beat out the competition. That's what a lot of the video game companies do. Like a lot of the next gen systems, when they first launched, they're sold at a loss.
You could do that, but that's not the same thing. It's sort of like inverse, right? I'm thinking about if somebody were to do that, of like, I will give you a discount on my labor. Um, Because I'm trying to think about, because like with consoles, if you sell consoles at a loss, like you're still going to get the money from the video games. Like the Kindles, they sell the Kindles at a loss because it's tied into the Amazon system, so that you're going to buy a shit ton of ebooks, which I totally do. Um, but what kind of ecosystem lock-in is there for labor? Like you could put in a contract or something of like, even that doesn't seem really feasible, because like labor's different. You can only sell at a lot. A loss would be accepting compensation that is less than the baseline that you need to be an alive person. You can't do that for very long. Like that's not really a viable labor strategy.
Well, the other major difference is labor and the person who owns the labor are dynamic. An Xbox is always an Xbox, but taking on extra duties is increasing your value. what you can argue for in the future, because you're building your skill set, you're building your trust. Well, you're building other people's trust in you as well. I've worked at more businesses than I can count, and I always try to get promoted into take on the next, become a manager or whatever the next level is. And a big part of that is always, learning other jobs, so that when you take that next step, you already know them and you can, help coordinate and direct other people.
That is also, to me, really strange. In that, so workers selling their labor don't have a whole lot of autonomy. So the way that capital, I'll just say employers. So there is this, there's this culture, right? There's this work culture. It's like based on hourly, and the manager thing is also super interesting. That like you start off, doing whatever menial task, starting at the bottom or whatever, and as you climb up, you get more and more into management roles. And so there is this implication that management is higher. I assume it's because you're directing people and telling them what to do, but the skill set for manager is significantly different from like the labor that you were originally setting out to do. That also I find very strange, and also in conflict with the idea of labor being being capital that is owned by the worker. Because like the labor, like the worker does not have autonomy over their labor within these systems in the same way that like any other capital is used. And so if we want it to be consistent, if we are starting with the premise that it is capital, then it should also be treated like capital rather than being treated as like, here is a structure that we made up for you to climb this ladder.
But that is how capital is treated.
What do you mean?
Well, to address your earlier point, managers are expected and usually do all the work of the people below them. Every good manager I've ever worked with knew how and was capable of doing my job and the guy next to me's job and everything else. Most of them, especially in the hourly type jobs like factory work. I worked in a lumber mill, convenience stores, fast food. The manager has to be able to do it well enough to train somebody to do it and to take over if the person isn't there. So
Okay.
so that's still, so it's not like it's a different skill set. It's an additional skill set. And the first step to getting that is learning more than one job. As for how that is similar to other forms of capital, any other form of capital requires investment and building on. You have to, we'd consider heavy machinery to be capital. It has to be maintained. It has to be given energy, all the inputs. It has to get updated. The difference is it's static, and humans are not. We're dynamic, as is our labor.
I'm not sure I follow how that. So when I was saying that it is unlike capital, I was saying that there is sort of a pre-existing structure that labor needs to adhere to with most employers, and that I think that's cultural, because it's not just like a handful of employers or even necessarily very large employers, but like this idea of like, so management, being a manager is a different skill set. I agree, you need the skill sets of all of the people that you are managing. You need to, at the very least, be aware of how these jobs are done in order to be able to manage them. I'll have you know that that's not a necessity in a lot of management jobs, but I agree that
I'm aware.
Yeah. But management itself is a skill, and making it sort of like a default of like a promotion means that you're going to be a manager. Like somebody, okay, so drawing from my own experience, I worked in a place with administrative coordinators. There was an administrative coordinator who had been there for 14 years. She knew everything, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she would be a good manager. It seems pretty messed up to me that somebody with this wealth of knowledge, extreme competence, she was easily the most competent person in that office, that she would be locked into a lower wage, not eligible for salary, and like just because she doesn't have management skills, which is a different, it's a different role. It's a different role entirely. I don't think that makes sense.
I would agree. From a strictly capitalist perspective, I would consider that wasting your human resources. You would definitely want somebody like that to be properly compensated, even if she isn't willing or able to do managerial work. She's been with the company for a long time and is extremely competent. She should be paid accordingly.
Yes. Cool. Glad we agree on that. But that points to, it's like an aspect of culture that there is a pre-existing system. Many of the hierarchical systems, for what is it called, like vertically structured companies or whatever, they operate that way.
Well, yeah, when systems get built, they get they become a system. I mean, I don't know a better way to say that, but systems are the way they are for reasons, and they develop and grow. They're not perfect. There's always stuff that doesn't fit right. Yeah. Again, humans are dynamic. We're not one size shapes, or one size fits all. But for the most part, I mean, and like I said, it still doesn't detract from from what I was saying. It's still it's still that system where their employees are building on themselves, either becoming more skilled and more trusted, or just learning. And that's why it is capital, because that makes you more valuable. And if your current business, or their current business, like the woman you were talking about, if she wasn't being justly compensated, she has an incredibly competent skill set that she could take to another firm.
Which she totally did, by the way.
Good for her.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm thinking about some of the other things that you said about how there's like, I don't disagree that it's a good idea to build your skills. But a problem that I see with the hourly model is that if we assume that you're not selling like okay, so now we do an assumption with the per unit compensation. Say it was like drafting blueprints. And somebody were to be getting paid per hour, and there are no blueprints that need to be drafted. The expectation under an hourly system is that it is not your labor of drawing blueprints that belongs to the company, but your time. And so for all of that time, you do whatever the company needs you to do, even though you signed up to draw blueprints. I think that's a problem.
Well, it depends on what they're having you do. To go to one of my actual salary positions, the Army, I was tasked with doing a whole lot of stuff that was not in my job description. Of course, the Army's job description is do it.
Yeah.
But like, I was pulled off of my actual job, leading my team and getting ready to go to the field and for a drill and exercise, a simulated encounter, whatever term is most clear, to meet a friend of the one of the higher sergeants at the gate, at the post of the gate, and escort them to the PX, which was completely outside my job description. That's not that's not a proper use of my time. That's not a proper use of to keep it in the business sense. That wouldn't be a proper use of me as a resource.
Mm-hmm.
And that should not be allowed. But there are plenty of other duties to stick with the blueprint example you were giving. There's plenty of other related duties to that. I mean, whatever they're drawing it on, making sure you have all the stocks and supplies you need, possibly ordering. Although that's usually a higher, more managerial type of job.
Department.
Yeah, but it also
you
depends.
can combine those.
Yeah, and a lot of people do. But
I think it would be appropriate to combine those, but you would also want the like if you started as just a drafter and now they're having to do ordering. I think it makes sense to have more compensation because you're doing another job.
Exactly. But if we're on a purely compensation basis, like per draft, you're not being incentivized to do the other parts of your job. Basically only the bare minimum. Now, and I will admit, because I've worked commission before, there are some pros to that, especially for somebody who's really ambitious. You put in the extra time on your own dollar to train, to practice, to set up, and it pays off by getting more results. I saw that a lot in sales. And in fact, the couple of sales jobs I've had, we were expected to show up for like 3 hours uncompensated every day, just for practice and coordination.
But you were expected to do that? Like it was part of your job to be there for 3 hours and not get compensated for those 3 hours that you were required to be there?
Yeah, 100% commission. You didn't sell, you didn't get paid.
Okay, but they can't. I mean, obviously legally they could, otherwise that wouldn't be a thing. But under this context of labor is capital that is owned by the worker, they're stealing 3 hours from you.
No, I'm investing 3 hours. And for me, that was
but it wasn't optional.
I didn't have to take the job. And I didn't keep the job because I wasn't good at it. It was a really poor investment for me. I left. I did learn a lot. I still have my notes from that. I've put sales on a lot of my resumes since then, and I'm pretty sure it's helped me. But it wasn't a good investment in that job. I could not produce, so I didn't get compensated at all.
I don't think that the 3 hours makes sense under the context of labor as capital requiring you to be there for 3 hours without compensating you for that time. That is a situation in which they like own your time. I don't think it makes sense in that context. If we are assuming as a premise that labor is capital, like I don't think it makes sense.
Well, then let's ignore that 3 hours and just look at the, 5 hours or so that we spent doing rounds.
Yeah.
There was weeks where I didn't make a single sale. So I was holding up my contractual end of it, what I agreed to do. And because I did not produce anything at that time, I got no compensation. If they had been paying me for my hours, if they'd been paying me for my time, I would have.
But you didn't produce.
Yes. And if I was being paid hourly, I still would have gotten paid. There's been a lot of jobs where I have been hourly, I haven't produced jack, and I got paid for it. Look
I
at how
also don't think that makes sense with labor as capital.
it's the agreement made.
What do you mean?
I do what I agreed to. So, I mean, like, I should not be on this or the other servers that I am as much as I am during the workday, but I'm getting paid to do it.
Okay, so you agree that that doesn't make sense in the context of labor as capital.
Well, I mean, your position is that I shouldn't get paid at all, although my job doesn't have a set production level.
Yeah, well, it depends on what you're doing. So, like, I don't know what your current role is, but if you were in like a managerial role and you're being paid salary, like that makes sense to me. If you're being paid hourly to argue with me on Discord, no, I don't think that makes sense in the context of labor as capital. Yeah, it is an advantage. It's a cool thing that you get to do, but it's just not consistent. It's not consistent with that premise.
I'm just trying to think how to word it better. I think what I'm trying to say is that even though I'm poorly investing, my energies, I'm still giving the labor I agreed to, which is both the tasks I'm given and the time I spend in the office.
Okay, so you are actually physically in the office.
Yeah, and the way my brain works, I my attention span is bad enough at work. It's if I'm home, it's even worse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so like the question that I have with that is like, if there is a requirement to be in the office for a set number of hours, that makes sense to pay hourly. Like if there is if the requirements of you include a set amount of time, that makes sense to be paid hourly. Like a receptionist obviously is not doing receptionist stuff. Like being a front desk worker, you're not doing front desk stuff. You're only doing things when people come in to check in or arrive for their appointments or whatever. But you still have to be there that whole time, and so that makes sense to me because you're paying for them to be there for the time, just in case, right?
Well, I've been that front desk person before, and right now I'm in an administrative job. Mm-hmm. Even when there's nobody at the desk, there's still a lot to do.
Yeah, which most people would want to do that because doing nothing is horrible. That's speaking from experience.
Amen.
Yeah, but like if you want to do other things, like that makes sense. But if you're hired on to be like a front desk person and like you have like a list of duties or whatever, if you have extra free time, like say you completed okay, I'm just going to use my experience as an example. You're like a front desk person. You're there for when people want to check in for their appointments. You're also responsible for confirmation calls. And you are also responsible for like initial like registration documents, right? And so you keep your stack of registration documents. You've made all of your confirmation calls, and nobody is coming up to the desk. You can like go around and like straighten stuff up, I guess, so maybe everything looks perfect. Like you don't have anything to do. I don't think it makes sense to like then require you to do another task that wasn't part of the original agreement, unless you're going to make a new agreement about it.
Well, my point is by doing other tasks in those situations, you're increasing your value. So that when it comes time to either find a new job or to renegotiate your pay there, you're worth more to that employer or the next employer.
I agree that it's a good idea. I don't agree that it should be required.
I mean, it's usually not, unless there's just a lot of
It
other.
often is.
It depends on the nature of the work, but that's getting a little off topic, I think,
Well,
or maybe too in the weeds.
I don't know that it's necessarily getting off topic, because the reason. So now we can talk about the wage slavery point, right? The implication is that your time has been purchased, right, rather than your labor. Like that's what that turned into. So like with a front desk person, you just need to be available. Like that's the main thrust of your job, is that you need to be available. Somebody needs to check in. If you have completed everything that supports that duty, then it shouldn't matter what you do, because you're hired to sit there and check people in when they show up, you know? If you move it over to the blueprint thing, where you're getting paid per unit, if you have that be an hourly and there's no blueprints to churn out, there's no work that you can do to support or make your blueprint churning out easier. They will have you like do other shit, like, or they will say like you can't sit around and do nothing. You have to ask your manager for other tasks that have nothing to do with your job, because if they had something to do with your job, you would be assigned them. And you have to do that. That is part of it. If you don't do that, you get fired. If you sit around and you're not doing anything because you don't have anything to do that's in your job description, you get in trouble. You get written up. And that is an implication of an ownership of time, rather than me selling the labor of drafting blueprints.
Yeah, but it's still related to your job. It's just part of the broader expanse of it.
I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, your job is part of a. Your job is just part of a larger system, and by your manager having you do other tasks, again, referring to my shady sergeant, as long as they're related to the actual work, even if they're not part of your job description, they're still part of the job, just in a broader context. So it's the same thing I've been saying. It works better if you show initiative and seek out the other work yourself or coordinate with your boss. But if you're there and your boss can rely on you, it's still showing an investment in your own skill set and the firm, making you more valuable.
Right. Yeah. But my issue is with that being a requirement rather than just like a cool thing you can decide to do.
But it's what you agreed to do when you signed up.
But it's not, because you just said that they're not things that are part of your job description. Like, it's part of the job in the broader context, but it's not part of your job description. It's not part of the job that you signed up to do. Like, just because you sign up to work at a company to do a certain job, to like produce something in particular, whether you produce management or you produce blueprints or you produce checked-in clients, you're not implicitly responsible for all of the duties of the company.
Well, most contracts have a in all other duties as the company requires clause in there.
And I'm saying that doesn't fit the context of labor as capital. It doesn't.
But that is the context. That's the trade the employee is made with the employer, and that's the contract. That's what you've traded. And if it's a bad deal, you either you hopefully legally or illegally break that contract and go elsewhere.
I think are we gonna go into the voluntariness thing? Hold on. I don't want to do the voluntariness thing.
Hold on. Can I interject and maybe
Yeah.
shift the parameters a little bit? Because I remember how I originally brought it into the context of justice. So now I want to ask you guys, because we're kind of getting at an impasse where it's like you're both kind of agreeing that you are selling your labor, but I'm noticing that there's some kind of contradiction in what Stray versus Knightley is believing is the labor being provided. Because it seems like Stray here is saying that you are signing up to provide your labor in a specific context, but because of how society is set up, you're being kind of coerced into doing things beyond what you are signing up for. Whereas Knightley says, no, you know what you're getting into. Whenever you sign up for a job, you have the understanding that this is the tacit agreement, and so you ought to do what is best for both you and the company, which usually are aligned, is what I'm getting from each of you, right? Am I correct in that?
That sounds correct, yeah.
Okay. So my question then is, well, okay, so this might be how it is, and you might be disagreeing on it, but what makes your position the more just one? Like, why should the worker have more autonomy in what they do in the workplace, or why do you think that they ought to follow? Why should the employer have so much power over what the worker does on their time, right? Like, why is the worker able to set such broad parameters and such broad time constraints on the employee versus like why can't the employees have more autonomy over this? Because like not every job that you sign up for you intend to progress or even use them as a reference, right? Like sometimes people are just there to make money in the meantime, right? So like why ought you do this when that's not necessarily even what you're using this job for? That's my question.
Well, if I may start that off, the justification is that you're entering a larger system, and the people in charge are more familiar with that system. You only know you're a part of it. That's what you're expected to do, mostly autonomous, mostly on your own. But when they're pulling you from other tasks or limiting what you do, it's because they're, again, ideally, because they're seeing a bigger picture than you are. They know how different systems are moving around. They're allocating the resources at their disposal, the labor you agreed to give them.
I'm not sure I understand how that's related. Hold on. I'm going to take a pause here. I'm thinking about it from the justice context. I'm also thinking about it in, so the original title that we had for this debate was, where is it? Hourly wage is the norm or the exception. And so, Knightley, your position was that hourly wages should be the norm. I think it's important to include the context of labor as capital, because that's sort of like the foundation that mine is built on. But I think that it should be the exception for those, those duties that I have already described that are based on your actual time being spent. And that would be the exception. And so the argument that I'm hearing from you is that hourly should be the norm because you have agreed with your employer that it is the norm, which doesn't seem to support that. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm not saying hourly should be the norm. I'm saying
Okay.
a time expectation is reasonable and normal and even beneficial to both parties to an extent, even if it's inconvenient. To say that more succinctly, it's not that I'm saying an hourly wage is the norm. I'm saying that in giving that time, a set amount of time, is expected.
Okay, but I'm saying it shouldn't be expected.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I think, hold on real quick, Knightley, I think you need to give an argument for that, right? Like, you think it should be, but like, given the context that labor is, sorry, let me reread sorry, labor is capital. Why do you believe that you should be given all these arbitrary tasks if you're not actually providing the labor that you are selling to the company?
Well, first of all, they're not arbitrary. Assuming the manager is acting in good faith, the tasks aren't arbitrary. They're not part of your basic job description, but they're still part of the job. And since you've sold them your labor, they're using that labor to do more of the work. And by doing so, investing in the laborer, the employee.
Okay, so let's bring this back to capital, and I want to give maybe an analogy of like, say you're using your capital to pay. I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to try it anyway. You're using your labor to pay somebody to do a task for you. And the person who's doing a task for you is they have a greater overview, analogous to a manager, of like what is needed for the task to get done. And they decide to use your capital to do something completely different than what you asked for. And when you ask them why they did that, they say, well, it's related because if you look at it in this broader context, this task contributes to the system that this is in. And you say, well, no, the agreement was the capital was for this particular task. What do you think of that?
That sounds like a very different situation. It sounds more like I'm hiring that person as a contractor, not an employee.
Yeah, I assuming that's why I wasn't sure if it was going to work. Because it's specifically in the context of labor as capital, and so we replace labor with, actual dollars. I don't think that works. Can I get Nietzsche? Can you pop in here and let me know if that analogy was like useful, or if maybe you have a better one to get the same idea across?
Sorry, but can you repeat it?
Yeah. So the analogy. This is so tangled, right? So the analogy with labor as capital. So say that you instead of labor being your capital, you're using actual dollars, and you are paying a person to do a job. So the agreement is this exchange of capital for a certain result. And that person decides to do not the task that you had asked them to do, the task that you had agreed on, but they instead did a different task. And when you asked them why they did that, they said, oh, well, it's related to this, to the greater system in ways that you maybe can't see. And you're like, no, we agreed that this task would be done.
I think that makes sense. I don't want to assert myself too much because I feel like that's unfair, but I will say that I think there's a broader culture of exploitation that's being missed because it is the case that workers are expected to give their time and be available in a way that capital is not. And so they are always missing out on use value and like the utility that they can provide themselves, given that they are like coerced basically to do things outside of their job descriptions, even when they have provided the labor that they are contracted to.
Okay. I might have to come up with a different analogy then to get the idea across. Because, like, yes, I agree with that. And I also get why you didn't want to pop in with that, because that is, yeah. I don't know. Okay, we can go in a different direction. So one of the things that I'm thinking of with an hourly, okay, so there's this concept of overemployment, right? So it is an idea where people will get multiple jobs, usually remote jobs, and they are able to complete the duties of both jobs at the same time. They are being paid hourly for this work. And it's not a good idea to let the companies know about each other, because the concept is, or like the status of the culture as it is that you are stealing time from the company, quote unquote. You are getting all tasks done in both jobs, but both employers consider that stealing. That doesn't make sense in the context of labor as capital.
I actually agree with that analogy. If the employee can do two jobs at once, then more power to them.
Yeah. Well, shit. So we agree.
But I think you don't agree, because Knightley's arguing that you should be available, right? And you should do all these extra tests that they ask you. So it seems like he's contradicting himself here.
Okay.
I don't see it that way, because they're two very different situations.
Well, no, they're not, because in both cases you're expected to be available, right? Like, so the person that is having two remote jobs is getting away with it, right? They're hiding it, so they're technically doing something that's prohibited, and they're not following the rules. And you're saying that you ought to follow the rules and always ask the employer for more work when you should, because that is what you're signing up for, right?
No, yes, and they'd build a lot. They'd be investing more in in one of their employees by focusing on that one. But if they want to spread themselves thin like that, that's their choice. It's their labor and their capital. They can trade it as they want, especially in remote work when they're not under direct supervision.
I mean, is that not a contradiction from what you were saying earlier, though? To me, it seems like it definitely is. I mean, I don't know. I'm going to step out, but that's my...
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like it to me, because you're still available. And if the employer is letting you work at home, they're trusting you with that extra flexibility.
Yeah, I mean, not really, though, because like I said, it's prohibited. You know, they still see it as like you are stealing time from the company, but you didn't sell the company your time, you're selling the company your labor. And so my question is, like, if you say the concept of overemployment makes sense, then why is that not also applicable to if you only have a single job? Like, why is it that you need to stay busy when you only have one job, but if you have two jobs and you're busy working on the other job, you don't have to do busy work for your first employer?
Because they aren't paying. They're not asking you to do busy work then. They're having you work at home, away from the busy work.
Okay, so the implication that if you work at home that you're not expected to look busy.
Well, it's not about looking busy, although that's...
It is usually.
Yeah, usually it is. I know, I've done that plenty. But in theory, it's not about looking busy. It's about doing other tasks. And you're still doing other tasks. There's just less access to other tasks if you're working remotely.
Yeah, well, often the requirement is to ask your employer for more tasks. And I mean, I saw this happen even in an office context of, okay, so I was working in a clinic and I had my own office, and it was indeed my duty to meet with clients. And I had met with all my clients, did all my documentation. If I sat around and I didn't have anything to do until closing, I couldn't like go home. You know, I still had to be there. And the expectation wasn't, well, the expectation was sort of that I sit there and do nothing. But what I was told is that I should be, there was, I guess, like a requirement to go find like a webinar to watch or like a course to take. So there's like a requirement to improve my skills as opposed to like me doing that voluntarily, which for the record, I totally was doing that voluntarily. I love that job. But I don't think it makes sense to have that be a requirement. I think it's like if my skills are competent to treat clients in the way that I am expected to treat clients, it should not be a requirement for me to use any extra free time that I have to work on those skills. Like I could use that free time instead to have a remote job, maybe. I think that makes the most sense. So prohibiting me from doing anything else with that time is them claiming ownership of my time rather than my labor.
But my point remains: that's what you're trading. You're giving them that.
Yeah, in meeting with the clients, I am giving them that labor. Yes, because that's what I agreed to do. That's the job. But in times where I was paid hourly, right? So that was kind of the problem that I'm dealing with. I was paid hourly, and I got off work at 6:30, and I had no clients scheduled after 5 p.m. And I called everybody that I need to call, and nobody needs an appointment. I should be able to do what I want with that time, but because I'm being paid hourly, they have staked a claim on my time.
I'm suspecting our positions aren't sufficiently far apart to really go far in this, because I don't like that employment. I mean, when we had this discussion on Sunday, one of the first things that I said is my preferred method of compensation is salary with some extras for for extra time spent.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if we agree, basically, I don't know where to go from here.
I mean, to kind of lean into the position I have. I mean, if you agreed for the hourly job, then yes, it makes sense to be expected to do the extra tasks, to get ready for the day tomorrow. You go through your scheduling, whatever.
Okay, so I think we're reaching an impasse here again. I think maybe we'll end the formal part of the debate and we'll open it up to free-form discussion so people can come in and ask any questions they have. And maybe we'll do that for like as long as you guys are getting questions, and then we can wrap it up. Because I'm not trying to cut you off, but I feel like we're just kind of circling back to the same points.
Yeah, I agree. We're definitely kind of circling.
Yeah, for sure.
So would anyone in the chat like to ask questions or further elaborate anything that's been said? Anything strike anyone?
If I could, I guess clarify, it seems like the one of the primary disagreements is like the level of commitment that's required from your job. So it seems to me that Stray and Nightly, you guys are saying like two different things, but saying that you guys are agreeing, which is making it very hard for me to elucidate it. But basically, what I think the main disagreement is that Knightley seems to think that if you're applying for exposition, that you should be able to just infer that that's a system and that they're going to have other requirements of you that aren't in the job description that you need to accomplish. And I would say that it seems to me that Stray's not agreeing with that, and that I would kind of, on my part, like to have that, I guess, cleared up. So I guess if either of you could say if you disagree with the other based on that, or if you want to clarify your position, that'd be probably great.
Well, I'm going to agree with your summation of it, because part of my position is definitely the inferred or unknown responsibilities that your labor can be used for once it's been traded.
Oh, that's interesting. Saying once it's been traded, because in my eyes, the trade's not really happening until you do the thing. So yeah, I think that is a point of departure of like when you agree to do something, you're agreeing to do that thing. You're not agreeing to do a completely different thing, even if it is related. So Yeah, when I see in terms of contracts, you are agreeing, in fact, to the terms of the contract, and I don't think it makes sense to say other duties as required. I don't think that makes sense. It's like a default if we're keeping in the context of capital, the labor is capital. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
I think that pretty much answers my question. I guess like what I really wanted to see in that discussion was more conversation between you two about that disagreement rather than just saying, oh, well, it's a disagreement and let's move forward. I think that's actually like the most important disagreement that I heard, at least.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's what I was trying to point out with my last question as well. I think Stray, you did a good job of kind of cementing yourself. Nightly, I feel like I'm not trying to like, and this is why this is in the informal section, but I'm still like confused. It seems like you both want to agree with what what Stray is saying, but then you're contradicting that with this like you're hammering, or sorry, you're what's the word? You're like really hammering down on this
Digging in.
point. Yeah, digging in. Thank you. Sorry, my mind totally blanked. You're really digging in on this idea that like you ought to do the other duties as required, but then you're saying things like, well, if you can get away with it, you can have two remote jobs, or like you should do what they ask you to do. Like things like just it feels like a bunch of contradictory stuff from your position.
That's probably due to my overly nuanced view on it. It's these are things I've thought about a lot, and like for the record, it's one of the reasons I'm not fond of remote work, both for myself and in
Oh.
general. I think remote work, makes it difficult to, you know, to do other tasks for your employer to build that network and connections there.
So then it seems like you don't agree at all, because it seems like you want basically all of us to be forced to do whatever our employers want us to do, and be like trapped in the physical space with them as well.
Well,
Interject a point on this. Like, I think I actually found a section out of a book I had recently read that kind of speaks to, I think, your point, Nietzsche, about this exact thing, which is that, capital is an impersonal form of power. It's not a personal relation of dependence, like the ones in other modes of production. But you still have to sell your labor. Like, that is a form of dependency all its own.
Yeah, would either of you like to speak to that? I think that's a good quote. Ray, we haven't heard from you for a bit. Do you agree with that?
I'm trying to think of how it slots into this context. Because like, yes, I agree that we have to sell our labor. We don't have a choice in the matter. I also think it's interesting to note, Nietzsche, what you brought up before. Sometimes people aren't trying to climb up the ranks or get better, show their value or whatever. They're there to do a job and to get paid. And I feel like this is going back in circles again. Like, it makes sense if you want to do extra. Like in my particular context, I did want to do extra because I really enjoyed and really cared about my job. But if somebody doesn't want to do extra, then they shouldn't be required to, because they're selling, like, yeah. So it's just the context between, like, if you're selling your time, your employer decides what you do with your labor, which is not you being in control of capital, as capital is typically controlled.
So I think Chase's quote then would elucidate like why that's the case, that they even are able to require, like, why does the worker not have the negotiating power to prevent that from happening?
Oh yeah. Which I see as being a little bit outside of the scope of, like, why is it set up that way? I think the scope of this is, like, I think the way that it's set up is bad. But yeah, no, I agree.
Okay. Nightly, feel free to respond to. Do you?
All right. I'm trying to make sure I'm formulating right because I know I didn't have a very strong position, and that's part of why I was going around circles. And I know there's a lot of contradictions in my position. As I said before, I definitely overanalyze these topics. I've seen a lot. I've worked a lot, different jobs, different compensation models, all of it. And while I'm not as opposed to the current systems, I'm not 100% for them either. So I definitely recognize some of your criticisms, but I can still speak to why the systems work like that to an extent. For me, when you're selling your labor, I mean, you're selling it. You don't entirely control it anymore. You still control yourself, your body, your thoughts, and that will always have an impact on it. But there's nothing wrong with expecting you to work more. Similarly, if you have time in your day, and mental capacity, everything else to do extra labor, whether for that firm or for another, that should also be your right. So I know that seems like a contradiction to y'all, but it doesn't entirely to me.
I'm not sure that I understand. I wonder if maybe I can polarize this a little bit by returning to the wage slavery concept. So like if an employer has control over your time beyond the scope that you had originally agreed to. So like that clause, other duties is required. Let's call that a slavery clause. For the time that you are being paid, you are actually a slave to the employer for that length of time. For every hour that you are paid, you are a slave.
No, slaves aren't paid, and slaves are.
Some slaves are. There's like indentured servitude and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's true. Some slave sources, but slavery, especially in the modern, especially as we think of it today, generally implies a greater degree of responsibility on the part of the owning party that we don't see in employers today.
Yeah, well,
I
there
should
is sort
add
of a
that-
response.
I'm sorry. That was actually a critique of Southern slave owners had of a Northern capitalist industry, was that they don't take care of their workers.
Irony abounds.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a lot of the same power relationship without sort of like a total commitment to well-being. And depending on the employer, that does actually happen sometimes. So they do take a responsibility for that. And I'm sort of thinking of like this if an employer can require you to do things to further your skills, to further your understanding, to like develop, right? If they can force you to do that, I think that's analogous. So they are taking responsibility for your growth. So now not only do they own your labor and your time, but they also own your growth. And ownership in the context of they have power over it.
Well, that falls under you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can require somebody to learn all you want, but that doesn't make them learn.
But that's not different from slavery. That's also the situation with slavery. You can make them do something, but you can't make them receive a benefit from it or develop or whatever.
Well, again, the difference is for wage labor, you've agreed to it, and you can leave.
Is that the only part that makes it not slavery?
Yeah, I mean, your employer. If I quit my job, my employer can't chase me down and have me, arrested or whipped.
Yeah. Okay, so let's call it voluntary slavery.
That just seems like a contradiction in terms.
Well, it's like indentured servitude, basically.
Right.
Same concept.
I won't deny that some employers are trying to build systems with that extreme of a power difference, but I don't see it existing today because, again, you can leave.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
then where
well,
do you go? You go to another employer that's doing the same thing. And I mean, you've been to tons of jobs. Like the dynamic is roughly the same across the US at least. I mean, I don't know about other countries, but you have the same expectations. It's the same class that's making the rules for it. And you might get better or worse jobs, but even then, like you get a good boss, they'll even tell you their hands are tied as to what they can give you, you know?
But that's the nature of any form of employment. There's no system where you're
that's the problem.
but that's always going to be the issue. I mean, that was true before capitalism. That was true. That's going to be true with whatever comes after capitalism. If you selling your labor, you're going to be part of that
Actually,
bigger system.
if you would let me, it's actually like the not like true before capitalism. If
Right.
like if we're looking at it from that perspective, like farmers did not need to constantly be working, constantly be improving themselves for like the kingship. They're just working on whatever they need to for the day, and then they focus on other stuff. That's not to say it was like a great way to live. I mean, there's a lot of problems with agrarianism, but I mean, for what it's worth, in agrarian societies, that wasn't the case.
Well, that's because they work for themselves.
They
And
don't work for
even
themselves. That's
they did work
false.
for
Like
themselves.
empirically, no, they don't. They work according to a contracted system, an informal contract between them and their the person that controls their serfdom.
Yes, and they got a lot of and they got services in exchange for that, and those contracts generally only included a few days of labor and a certain amount of their harvest, usually a
The
few tons.
production of their labor. They're paid.
Yeah, but they didn't work for them.
But
They were in
they
control
did.
of their own area.
Okay, so why are workers not in control of their own labor in the same way?
Because they're selling their labor to somebody else. And this happened in the medieval period as well. Laborers in the cities, apprentices, day laborers. They just didn't have the long form contracts that we have today.
Wait, they were paid.
What time period are you talking about?
Well, what I was just referring to was
the class of people that would be able to do that in this society is like so fucking tiny that I don't really think that's like true.
It was true. It was the underclass in the urban areas in the medieval period.
All right.
It's
So
hourly?
real quick,
All right, you know what? It's besides the point, so I'll let it be. Whatever.
no, real quick, we're gonna end the recording part, and you guys are free to discuss. We're gonna have another debate at 10, so if you want to join in, but you guys are free to stay in this channel and discuss this topic as much as you want. But
Okay.
I think Lego's going to end it.
Sure.